So this lecture is about the properties of water, and it's part of our study of Unit 1, the chemistry of life. So one of the most important things you're going to learn in this slide, in this lecture, is the idea that water is what we call polar. That's probably one of the most important things that you need to understand for this unit. Water being polar is going to allow you to understand and explain why water can do all the cool things it does. Pretty much all the properties of water that we're going to talk about, the reason water can do that is because it's polar. So that phrasing, water is polar, pretty much will answer most questions you get specifically about water from this unit. So what does that mean that water is polar? Water is polar means that the intermolecular forces, so it's inter, which means between, and molecular, which very simply means molecules. It means the attraction between the individual molecules of water. So not the bonding. We're not talking about the bonding, the exchange of electrons between the hydrogen and the oxygen. We're talking about more of a magnetic attraction between the individual molecules of water. We say that intermolecular force, that IMF for short, is polar. The reason why it's polar is this hydrogen bonding. So the hydrogen bonding is the type of IMF, intermolecular force, that is in water. So when we say, what is the intermolecular forces between water? How would you describe that? We're going to say it's hydrogen bonding. It is very, very, very strong as far as intermolecular forces go. It's not quite as strong as an actual bond, like a covalent or ionic bond, but it is still a very, very strong force. Think like a very strong magnet. So this whole phrase right here, water is polar, it has a strong hydrogen bond or has strong hydrogen bonds, that can pretty much answer almost every why does water blank question that you're going to see. Why does water do this? Water does that because it is polar and has strong hydrogen bonds. This polarity, or what polar means, is that the electrons between these molecules are unevenly shared. So that's what polar means. Polar is uneven sharing of electrons, and that creates a magnetic-like charge, which means that these molecules are attracted to each other. So because of that property of water, that allows it to do most of the things that we're going to talk about later. So some of the properties of water that we're going to talk about, there are more than this, but these are the ones that we're going to concentrate on. These properties are unique to water. Water does a lot of things other liquids can't do. So the first one is strong cohesion-adhesion, high heat capacity or specific heat. These are synonyms, so they mean the same thing. We're going to talk about its density as a solid and the fact that it is an excellent solvent. We're going to talk about each one of these individually. So first we're going to talk about cohesion and adhesion. These are properties that all liquids and most materials have. It's just that the cohesion and adhesion that exists in water in particular is unique. So cohesion and adhesion, the way you tell the difference is the first part. So the co start here, that's going to mean the same. And the add part here is going to be the different. So what they mean is cohesion is when a substance is more attracted to itself than something else. So it's the same. And adhesion is when a substance is more attracted to something else than itself. This is one of those things where they both exist. So cohesion and adhesion are kind of always existing. It's which one's stronger. So we say that a substance is cohesive if it's more attracted to itself. We say a substance is adhesive if it's more attracted to something else. Now, in water, because of those two things we just talked about, because of its polarity, the fact that water is polar and it has strong hydrogen bonds and it's very, very, very attracted to itself, that means that water shows very strong cohesion and at times very strong adhesion with other substances. So most of the time, water has a very strong attraction to itself and to something else. For example, glass. Water is strongly adhesive to glass. So what we see is in narrow tubes, water actually, it kind of adheres, I like to use the word climbs up a glass. So this is a wider tube. If you've ever heard of a meniscus, that's what's showing here. The reason a meniscus forms is because in this kind of middle of the water, it is strongly attracted to itself. It's holding on to itself. But at the parts where the water and the glass hit, there it is very adhesive. So what the water does is it kind of climbs up the side of the tube, and then other waters kind of climb up, and it kind of makes that almost curved pyramid shape. When you have a very narrow tube, so this is a wide tube, this is a narrow tube, there's not as much room to spread out, so the water can actually almost climb up the tube. So it's like this water molecule sticks to the side, this one's going to climb up between those two, almost like a cheerleading pyramid type thing, and that allows the water to climb up the tube. That is a unique property of water, the fact that water can do that. And again, the reason water can do that is because it has high or strong cohesion and adhesion because of its polarity and its hydrogen bonds. This property of strong cohesion and adhesion is going to allow water to first have very strong surface tension or high surface tension. So what surface tension is the idea that there is like a film on the surface, again, that's where you're going to get surface tension of water. So that's what you're looking at here. So here, this bug right here, if you look very closely at the pictures, it almost looks like the water is indented. This bug is not floating. What it's doing is the legs and stuff, it's so spread out, it doesn't break the surface tension of water. So again, it's like there's a film over the water that this bug is not breaking. You can actually do this with a paper clip and a beaker, and we're actually going to try that so you can see it hands-on. But what surface tension is the idea that if you look in the middle here, so we're looking at this part of the water drop, kind of the middle. This water molecule here is surrounded on all sides by other water molecules. So what ends up happening is, yes, those water molecules have strong cohesion with each other. So they are pulling this water molecule in all these different directions. But when this water molecule is in the dead center, all these forces balance out. So the fact that the water is being pulled, this water molecule is being pulled strongly this way, but also the opposite way, when you get to physics, that means that these two pulls kind of cancel each other out. So when you're pulling in equal and opposite directions, there's not an overall net movement. So in all these molecules that are surrounded by other water molecules, it's just a net of zero. All that pushing and pulling just equals zero. But at the very surface, so at this water droplet, there are water molecules that are just one right on the very surface. It has all that push and pull on the bottom, but because there's no water molecules on the top or on the sides here, this downward pull has no upward pull to counteract it. So it's not being canceled out by anything pulling up. So what happens is this ends up with a net pull down. So because there's no force pulling this water molecule up at the surface, it's just only pulling down. So because that pull is very strong, again, because water is polar and has strong hydrogen bonds, that net pull of down is very, very, very strong. So what happens is we say that water creates an elastic surface because all the surface water are pulled inward, and that's why water forms droplets. So you can see the water droplets here. You've seen this on a car windshield. Whenever water is kind of spread out like that, it's going to form drops. Not every liquid does that. So water, that's a unique property of water that's going to do those droplets. Again, it also allows water striders to walk on water. So there's some other properties that this high surface tension that is unique to water. All right, so capillary action is the idea that water can climb up a narrow tube. So we kind of talked about this with adhesion and cohesion, the way the water kind of climbs on itself. So when you have a narrow tube of water, the water can actually climb higher than the surface of the water. It can actually climb, itself. Almost think like a cheerleading stunt. So what that does is plants Their stems are full of narrow tubes, so the water can actually climb up that tubing in the plants. So that's what you're seeing with this experiment here with the celery. Celery is made up of narrow tubes. So when you put celery in colored water, you can see that the water goes up the celery like that. It actually climbs up the tubes of the celery. And that process, that action is called capillary action. There's an opposite called capillary repulsion, and that's where it is pushed away. Mercury does that. So Mercury does an opposite, curved meniscus than water. But the idea of capillary action, the idea that water can climb up narrow tubes, is a result of the strong adhesion cohesion. Again, think about the cheerleading stunts. And if we go back all the way again, you're going to see a common theme. Again, the reason for this is because water is very polar and has very strong H bonds. So all those forces that exist are really strong. Now, cohesion, adhesion, the idea of capillary action, that all goes into the idea of transpiration. Transpiration is the process by which water moves up a stem or a root. So if you think logically about it, gravity says that water should only move down. Water should not be able to go against gravity and go into the roots and go all the way up a plant stem or even all the way up a tree trunk. The reason water is able to do that is because of capillary action and cohesion and adhesion. So plants, trees, all those kind of species, they have these tubes in their roots and stems called xylem and phloem. So phloem is actually how they get food up. The xylem is how they get water up. And xylem are narrow tubes. So the process of capillary action, the idea that water can climb itself using adhesion and cohesion, allows the water to climb up the xylem and the stem and the roots and go up the plant. And that process is called transpiration, that movement of water. So that allows plants to do that unique thing, that allows water to do that unique thing because of the strong adhesion and cohesion. So high heat capacity and specific heat are synonymous terms. They really mean the same thing. In general, you usually hear specific heat in chemistry for some reason. What specific heat is the heat required to raise the temperature of a substance by a given amount. Usually the default is 1 gram of substance by 1 degree in temperature. The key is if something has what we call low specific heat, that means it doesn't take a lot of heat to heat it up. It takes little amount of heat. This means it heats up quickly. So this is something like metal, a pan you cook with in the oven. It does not take a large amount of heat applied to raise the temperature. Something that has high specific heat means it takes a lot of heat to raise the temperature. So it heats very slowly. This is things like oven mitts, rubber, anything that is heat resistant, that has high specific heat. It takes a lot of heat, and almost think about it can absorb a lot of heat before the temperature is raised. So the idea of specific heat is best explained with examples. So when we see specific heat is small or low, that means it's easy to warm up. That's something like a cooking pan again. It heats up very quickly. Something where the specific heat is great or high, this is like an earthen clay pot, again, like oven mitts, rubber. It takes a lot of heat to heat them up. Water has very high specific heat. It takes a lot of heat to raise the temperature of water by 1 degree. Water can absorb a lot of heat without changing the temperature. So this property of high specific heat, the idea that water has high specific heat, allows it to. Water is able to act as something called a heat sink. This means that it's able to absorb heat from warm air and release stored heat to cool air, almost like a heat storage system. Because it takes so much heat to raise the temperature of water, it's able to kind of store that heat inside its molecules. What this does is it helps to create a more moderate climate near bodies of water. So you all have experience with this. Most of you are familiar with, the beach or the shore, New Jersey or Delaware. And in general, usually at the shore or the beach, it's cooler. A lot of times the weather can be a lot different. And the reason for that is because those cities are so near the ocean again is absorbing heat from warm air generally making it cooler, and then releasing heat when it's colder, making it warmer. So you see the picture here all along the coast of California, these towns, San Diego, Los Angeles, they have more of a moderate lower temperature. So you see 72, 73. And then the further you go inland, away from the water, it gets hotter and hotter and hotter, more severe temperatures. So the idea that the water can hold on to and release heat helps moderate climates near large bodies of water. This same idea also allows water to trap heat. So when it's very cold in those places that get cold or frozen, it allows to hold the heat in the water, which allows things to live there. So it's always the general rule of 4 degrees. You always want to remember 4 degrees. So what happens is in the summer, it keeps the lower part of the big body of water, like a lake or something like that, kind of lower. So if an animal needs to not be as hot, kind of like doesn't allow the animal to boil. But then also in the winter, if the top kind of layers of the body of water are frozen, the water has actually absorbed enough heat to keep the lower levels kind of a stable temperature. So this is one of the ways that animals are able to live in a frozen lake. Lakes can freeze totally over, and there can still be fish and frogs and stuff because they're able to live in that area where the heat kind of sinks to and is absorbed by this idea that water has high heat capacity. Evaporated cooling is basically how sweat is explained. So you all are familiar with the idea of when you get really hot, you sweat. And that confuses kids on how that could cool you down, right? How does making you sweat cool you down? Well, it's something called evaporated cooling. So when you have water on your skin, the heat actually leaves your body through the skin and moves to the water to help get rid of it and evaporate it off your skin. So what's happening is the heat is going from your body to the water. Again, almost like the water is soaking up or absorbing the heat, and it's pulling the heat from you, making you cooler. This is why we sweat. This is why animals, it's a cooling process. Animals who can't sweat, dogs, for example, that's why they pant. It is a way to cool down the body and remove some of the heat by moving it into water. So this diagram is showing you the process here. So you have your skin, your sweat gland, you have your hair. So what happens is you start to feel, or the body temperature rises, that causes or triggers the sweat glands to secrete sweat. You get liquid sweat on the top of your skin. What will then happen is the body heat, kind of contained down in this skin area, will move towards kind of the surface to help evaporate the water on the surface. And in that way, the hotter air is moving out of your skin into the water, thus cooling you down. Another unique property of water is that it is very dense. So in general, the idea of something floating, or an object will float, when we say it is less dense than the liquid it is in. So a solid will float when it is less dense than the liquid it is in. Most substances, their solid form is more dense than their liquid form, almost everything. Water in their solid form is actually less dense. That is a unique property of water that doesn't really happen a lot. Ice has a lower density than liquid water. It's not much lower, it's only a few decimal places, but it is enough where ice floats on water because the density of the ice is lower than the density of the liquid water. This is all due to the structure of hydrogen bonds, and then this is why lakes and ponds freeze top to bottom. That's why the ice doesn't come from the bottom, it comes from the top because of this idea that the ice is floating. So the density of ice is all about the arrangement of the hydrogen bonds, again, because of the polarity of water. So polarity, again, is a charge, and it kind of forces the water away from itself. So think about if you're standing next to someone shoulder to shoulder versus having your arms out. The hydrogen bonds, the polarity, actually forces the molecules farther apart. And a part of density is how many molecules do you have in a given area. So if you look at the liquid state, there isn't that pushing away. So they're actually closer together, meaning they're more dense than they are when the ice is frozen because those hydrogen bonds form and push away and leave more gaps between the molecules. So you can see that there's less stuff in this area. So this is how Ice is less dense than water, and that's why ice floats. Another property of water is that it's an excellent solvent. Sometimes it's referred to as the universal solvent. So a solution is made up of a solute dissolved in a solvent. So solute is usually the solid thing, so it's, the sugar you're dissolving in water, and solvent is the liquid. So we say that water is an excellent solvent, meaning it is able to dissolve and create a solution with lots of different solutes. So this diagram here, this is one of those things that if you understand it, it makes total sense. So this process we call this solvation. Solvation is the more scientific term for dissolving. So solvation is how you take a solid substance and it dissolves in water. So what happens is here you have a salt crystal. A salt is an ionic compound, so it has Na plus and Cl minus ions that are charged. Don't forget that water is polar and has hydrogen bonding. So think of water like a really, really strong magnet. So when you put this salt square cube into water, what happens is the water molecules attack and they use that force, that magnet force, and they kind of work together, and they start pulling off individual ions. You see the little blue and yellow things here. So those are individual pieces of the crystal. So think about it's pulling the crystal apart piece by piece. And that's eventually how the crystal kind of disappears from your view, because it has gone from the solid form to now individual pieces. So the water comes in and it kind of, pulls it apart like a magnet. The key though is after the water has pulled each ion apart, it then surrounds it and creates something called a hydration shell. So a hydration shell is just simply an ion surrounded on all sides by a water molecule. It does that because if these hydration shells weren't here and the water just picked off ions one by one and the ions are just kind of floating around, they would go back together. So this negative and positive, remember opposites attract, they would stick together and they would kind of reform a solution. So to keep them from going back together, you have to make these hydration shells, which kind of prevent them. They can't get back together. Notice though that it takes, here's 5 water molecules, etc. It's not exactly 5, that's kind of an arbitrary number. But it takes multiple water molecules to surround just one ion. This is why, in general, you need, twice as much water to dissolve a certain amount of salt. Hardly ever do you have equal amounts of solute and solvent. You usually need way more solvent because you need to surround these pieces. This is where the idea of soluble, unsoluble, saturated solution. So a saturated solution is one in which every single water molecule is busy forming a hydration shell. So basically nothing else can be dissolved because every water molecule is kind of occupied. Unsaturated means that there's water molecules available to dissolve, and then supersaturated is kind of a unique property. So there's different factors that affect the solubility. In general, you're going to remember like dissolves like. So that comes in with polarity. So things that are polar generally like to dissolve things that are polar. Things that are non-polar generally like to dissolve things that are non-polar. That's going to come into play not only in this chapter with water, but when we talk about the cell membrane, it's important to understand that idea of like dissolves like. But in general, as the temperature goes up, the solubility goes up. You guys have experience with that. Usually, like a hot cup of tea is going to be able to dissolve more sugar than a cold cup of tea. If you want to dissolve something, usually you try to heat it up. And then pressure, as pressure goes up, the solubility goes up. Now, there are some exceptions to this. For example, with the temperature goes up, the solubility goes up, only really affects liquids and solids. Gases is actually opposite. For gases, as the temperature goes down, the solubility goes up. And as far as pressure goes, for the most part, pressure changes don't really affect the solubility of solids and liquids, but again, they greatly affect the solubilities of gases. But if you just know those general requirements, you'll be okay. So 2 terms that have to do with this solubility idea that are going to be really important for us all year is the idea of hydrophilic and hydrophobic. So you see they both have the start or the prefix hydro, which is going to stand for water. Makes sense. Now, the philic part, now here it says affinity for water. You're going to think like. So hydrophilic substances like water. Hydrophobic substances, you should be familiar with the word phobic. That means scared. They have a fear of water. We sometimes call them water-fearing molecules. So you're going to think phobic like fear. So hydrophilic substances we use to describe something that has an affinity for water, that likes water. Hydrophobic we're going to use to describe something that repels water or fears water. So in general, hydrophilic substances, remember that like dissolves like. Water itself is polar. So in general, polar substances and ions are water loving. Hydrophobic, again, phobia, doesn't like water, water's polar. These are generally non-polar substances or hydrophobic. So examples would be cellulose, that's a type of carbohydrate, sugar, salt, they're all water-loving, hydrophilic. And hydrophobic, you have things like oils and lipids, fats. So that's the idea that oil and water don't go together. That's where that comes from. So an example in the body of a hydrophilic substance is your blood. Your blood is a solution. There's lots of things in there. And hydrophobic substance, again, would be the cell membrane, which we're going to talk in length about later. So the solubility of a liquid is measured in a couple different ways. We can measure it qualitatively. If you recall, qualitative means like a quality or a property. That generally means no numbers. So qualitatively, we use the term saturated versus unsaturated. So we talked about that a little bit. We talked about the process of solvation. So a substance is saturated when no more solvent can be dissolved. Again, usually what happens is the hydration shells are occupied, so it can't take any more of the dissolving substance, like the powder. Unsaturated means that more can be dissolved. It hasn't reached its max yet. And again, that usually means that there's water available to do the dissolving. Supersaturated is kind of not really a thing. It's almost like a fake thing where you can go above the saturation point, but you have to heat the substance really high and then cool it down really slowly. And what really happens is the molecules kind of get suspended instead of fully dissolved, but that is the term supersaturated. Quantitatively, so that word means numbers, like a quantity, we can actually physically, using numbers, measure solubility using molarity, mass or volume percent. Biology and ecology, environmental science, they use a lot of ppm, parts per million, and ppb, parts per billion. But these are just all ways to quantitatively, using numbers, measure solubility. So here we have the idea of an unsaturated. You see more can dissolve. Saturated usually means you've reached the max. So if you add any more, it's going to go to the bottom. And then supersaturated usually means stuff grows crystals. And we talked about that again with the hydration shell. Here are examples of calculating molarity. So molarity is calculated using moles of solute over liters of solution. Sometimes we write that M equals mole over liter. Mass percent, you're going to do kind of like a normal percent problem. You're going to do the mass of the solute over the mass of solution. So if you recall, the solute is the solid, the solvent is the liquid, the solution is the whole thing. So if you remember just general percent problems, it's usually part over whole times 100. Same idea. So solute over solution times 100. The difference in this two is just really the measuring factor. So mass percent, you're using mass over mass. Volume percent, you're using volume over volume, but it's the same idea. The part or the solute over the total or the solution times 100. And then here you're seeing parts per million, and it literally is pretty much exactly what it says. So if you're talking about something that is 1 part per million, that means for every 1 million water molecules, there's 1 of the solute. So it's very, very low concentration. And then we go all the way up here where you have 10,000 parts per million. That's just like a ratio, like a factor saying for every 1 million waters, there's 10,000 of this solute. So for this one, the higher the number. For most of them, the higher the number, the more concentrated the solution is. So acids and bases can also get tied into the idea of solutions because that's essentially what they are. An acid is a solution with a lot of H plus ions or low OH minus ions. And a base is a solution with high OH minus, low H plus. So you see here the difference. Again, it's kind of like the idea that they both exist again. Something that's an acid has way more H plus, not a lot of OH minus, and something that's a base has a lot of OH minus, not a lot of H plus. In both cases, these are just, again, solutions. The solvent or the solute actually is just water, and then these H pluses are OH minus. We kind of measure or determine acidity or basicity using the pH scale. So it goes from 0 to 14. Things that have a pH of 7 we consider neutral in the middle. So anything below 7 is an acid, anything above 7 is a base. So what's going to happen is acids are going to have, remember, a lot of H plus, bases are going to have a lot of OH minus. So you see here, this is HCl, a typical acid, and showing you in pieces, it's going to give off that H plus, which makes it acidic. And here we have NaOH, which is sodium hydroxide. It's a base. Again, that's going to dissolve and give out an OH minus, which makes it a base solution. Here is the pH scale with some examples of some types of solutions that have that pH. So again, the pH scale goes from 0 to 14. 7 in the middle is considered neutral, meaning neither acid nor base. Anything below 7 is an acid, above 7 is a base. So if we look here in the neutral, that's most of your body things, which should make logical sense. Your body should be neutral. So that's saliva, which is spit, water, blood, tears. That's in the neutral 7 range. Some acidic things would be urine, rainwater, vinegar, gastric juices. So the lower you get, the more acidic it is. And it's actually a power of 10. So it's not like 7 and 6. Oh, that's only 1 off. It's not that much. It's more like a power of 10. So when you go all the way down to gastric juice, gastric is stomach. So your stomach, the pH of your stomach contents is actually a pH of 2. So it's really acidic to help it dissolve. If you notice above 7, those are bases. There isn't a whole lot of natural biological bases. They're kind of just chemicals. Seawater is slightly basic. Your intestine is slightly basic. Otherwise, these things, magnesia, ammonia, bleach, those are just more chemical based. We don't have a whole lot of naturally occurring bases. Now, AP is going to ask you to calculate pH, but you see here in the picture, don't panic. Number 1, you're going to have practice. Number 2, they give you these equations, so you don't have to memorize them. So the 2 equations, most important ones, is the idea that to calculate pH, so it says what is the pH of, what you're going to do is take the negative log of the H plus, and these brackets here mean concentration. So what you're saying here is the pH is a function of the concentration of H plus. The greater the H plus, that's going to affect the pH. Now it is a negative log, if you understand that's where the base 10 comes from. Do not panic about this, just hold tight, I'll show you how you're going to do it. The other equation you have to know is that the concentration, remember that's the bracket, of H plus times the concentration of OH minus should always equal 1 times 10 to the negative 14. What this equation allows you to do is, if you only know the H plus concentration, you can calculate the other one using this equation. Again, we're going to practice. Don't panic. So again, we're going to practice this. Don't panic, but just giving you an example of how easy this is. When you do this in chemistry, it won't be like this. So we're going to do kind of the easy version of this. So the question here says, what is the pH of a solution with an H plus concentration of 1 times 10 to the negative 4th? I know, panic-inducing, don't panic. It says, since pH uses logs and bases of 10, completing these problems are easy. All you're going to do is figure out that the pH is equal to the exponent without the sign. So if it says, what is the pH if the concentration is 1 times 10 to the negative 4th? All you're going to do is look at the exponent, and you're going to see that the pH is just that exponent without the sign. So it's 4. Down here, what is the pH of a solution with an OH minus of 1 times 10 to the negative 8th? don't miss that this is not the H plus here. This is the OH minus. But good news, you can calculate OH minus using the same equation. So notice I have that the OH minus is 8, and I get that from right here. So it's the exponent without the sign. That's where I got that 8 from. And then this handy dandy equation here, think of like the pH scale as a scale of 14. The pH and the pOH should equal 14. So if I know that my pOH is 8, well, 14 minus 8 is 6. So they're just that simple. Don't worry, we will practice, but I just want to give you an idea. Don't panic. They are simple to do. And finally, we have the idea of buffers. So a buffer is really important in biology. You have them in your blood. The job of a buffer is to regulate the pH of that solution. So obviously in your blood, it's to help to keep your blood pH relatively close to neutral, to 7 or 7.4. If your blood goes a little bit lower than that or higher than that, bad things happen. It's called acidosis if it's too low, alkalosis if it's too high. The term alkali, by the way, is another term for a base. That can cause way major issues if your blood is off like that. So your blood contains these buffers that help it kind of figure out or neutralize some of the acid that's added to it. So what happens is every time the acid goes in here, the buffer in the liquid go ahead and neutralize it and turn it to water. And then if it's water, it's not H plus or H minus, it won't change the pH too drastically. There is a limit to this. So there is a point where the buffer will run out. So if acid just keeps getting added and added and added and added, the solution will turn acidic eventually. But the buffers kind of protect your body from, slight changes in your body resulting in that acidosis or alkalosis. It helps keep that pH neutral. You have in your blood, you have in your cerebral spinal fluid. Most liquids in your body have those buffers to kind of keep the pH neutral.